Hello again. Welcome to another episode of the GovX Show, the podcast for public sector changemakers. I'm Tim Coulthard, Community Director at Government Transformation Magazine, and delighted to say joining me today for a conversation is Doreen Grove, who is the Head of Open Government at the Scottish Government. When you think about open government, you maybe have ideas about transparency, maybe about freedom of information. But those are just some of the sort of smaller tactical elements of the founding principles of open government. Doreen joined me to discuss what those principles are and also look at Scotland's exciting 5-year plan for open government and how they're going to tackle some of the biggest issues the public sector is facing and civil society are facing through principles of openness and transparency. Really exciting work they're doing there. So looking forward to that conversation. Let's jump in now. So Doreen, welcome to the GovX Show. Very pleased to have you joining us today for a conversation.
Good morning.
So we're going to explore the broad and interesting topic of open government. And I think it's a term that maybe people are aware of, but probably have never unpacked the reality. What does it mean? There's some very clear definitions, some very clear outcomes and goals associated with that, particularly in the Scottish Government, as we'll find out. So really looking forward to exploring that. But let's set the scene a little. I'd really like to find out a bit more about you, your background and sort of your journey to this point now as the Head of Open Government at the Scottish Government. So give us a quick potted history of your sort of background and your career story so far.
Thanks very much, Tim. And it's lovely to talk to you. I think it is worth saying my background's probably slightly different to most people's. I am an archaeologist and historian. I worked in Historic Scotland, which is the Scottish equivalent of English heritage, for almost 25 years. And my work there was thinking about Scotland's place. So the monuments that we have in care and how Scotland thinks of itself. And that gives me a really interesting perspective on how I moved into central government at a time when we were designing our own country. That's not a political statement, of course, but at the point that the independence referendum was underway, there was a really interesting national conversation around what that meant and how we see ourselves and the things that matter here. And that completely resonated with the work that I'm interested in around democracy. And how we make sure that the work that government does is actually delivering what the people need, not necessarily what they want, but what they need, or what not they, because we are all part of the population and we should see ourselves in that way, I think. So I came into government now almost a decade ago and really that idea of Scotland being a reforming place, and trying to make sure that how government works is as important as what it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And I suppose, yeah, you think about government as this sort of, product of centuries of history and social evolution, but to have that moment where actually there's maybe not a blank sheet of paper, but a sort of moment in time where things are new, where there's an opportunity to really sort of define goals, to define ways of operating. A lot of countries, organizations don't have that chance. So interesting that was an opportunity. And so pivoting to the topic at hand around open government, I suppose you can say the term and it might conjure up a sort of vague sense of what that might be and some of the sort of, sort of honorable principles of operating in the right way. But as I said at the beginning, actually it means some quite specific things. And I know Scotland has a strong role to play in the Open Government Partnership. And so I'd like to start to understand what open government actually is, because I suspect that there's a few sort of, misconceptions about what it is, how it plays out, how it guides policy, practice, operations, whatever it might be. So help me understand open government. I appreciate there's a lot to it.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question because, of course, UK government were absolutely in with the bricks with open government from the very beginning and have led on some really interesting approaches. So open government as a partnership, as an international organisation, was established in the wake of the 2008-9 financial crash internationally. President Obama commissioned a report, but also looked at trust in government fall off a cliff after that. As Gordon Brown once said, perhaps we didn't jail enough bankers. There was a real sense that there was a dislocation between the actions of the state and solving the problem that was in hand. So there was a coming together of 8 heads of state and 8 heads of major NGOs to think about how you maintain and rebuild trust. And what that looked like is an organization which is now about 150 members, half state members and half what are now described as local open governments, but they're all places where there is an aim to do reform around the really important elements of making sure that your population can see what government is doing, can understand it properly, and can hold government to account. That ability to be involved and have some real agency around the things that the decisions that matter in your life. And each jurisdiction within open government will look at the priorities for itself. So the way that runs is each member of the open government family has an action plan that is developed with civil society and citizens around the things that really matter. In Scotland, we've always looked at that as the way we get some real transformation about how we do government. Trust in government is really vital. Unless we can demonstrate that we are trustworthy and we are constantly having that honest dialogue with the population, then the trust factor goes down. And we are watching both democracy and trust go backwards around the world. And we really won't get into any of the very recent problems with that, but they do highlight why this really matters. The pandemic has shown us that governments really need to be able to be seen as reliable, because unless you are consistent, unless you are basing your actions on real evidence and real people's understanding of that evidence, then you won't get the responses that you need. And Open Government Partnership around the world has done some really interesting work around the pandemic, looking at the jurisdictions where they have managed to keep relatively low death rates and the really powerful application of open government principles. Somewhere like Taiwan, where they have used digital technology to absolutely connect everyone around all of the issues, is an example of how those kinds of principles can operate.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at the sort of commonalities, I know there are some foundational principles around the Open Government Partnership. I think there are 4. I'd be interested in sort of getting your take on those. And I suppose the point is, why do they matter? How do they help is the key question. So I think the first one is around the increasing the availability of information about government activities. Now, we're living in an age where, in theory, there's information overload, there's information everywhere, but not all the information is helpful. Not all the information is delivered in a way that's helpful. So why is that increasing the availability of information about government activity matter, and how do you do it well, I suppose, is the question.
I guess, I mean, we saw President Obama saying that we failed to harness social media. It has, I suppose, back to my role as a historian, if you look at the great changes in our society over time, the points at which we change technology are the points where you get social disruption. It doesn't matter whether it's from the Iron Age or from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, or later examples. And one of the things we've kind of failed to do is recognize the weight of change that digital technology has brought. And open government has, from the very beginning, had a focus on data and information. And unless we take seriously the role of government as a place for trusted information, then actually we won't be trusted as the place to give it, unless we recognize the real need to have expertise, both lived expertise, but also scientific expertise. All of that kind of evidence really matters. And having a really consistent way of putting that out is the important thing. So in a way, it's not the amount, it's more the quality, making sure it's right, always being prepared to admit where you've got it wrong. These things are people recognize that information will change, but unless you understand the scale of information on something, for instance, like climate change, you'll have vacuous arguments that will tend to end up in a polarized position. So the need is, and there's no shortage of information about climate change. It is just the way it is promoted and interpreted. So that it's not just about the amount, it's about who you trust to give that information, and constantly demonstrating that. There's a really useful document that I think many public servants will know. It's called Understanding Your Political Nature. It's from the European Commission Joint Research Centre, but it several years ago now sets out why it really matters to have that openness. So you're not hearing that just from us. That is one of those areas where we can't expect people to do things we ask unless we can demonstrate that we are both listening and taking account of the evidence, but giving them sufficient information to make a value judgment on something that is often quite complex.
Yeah, and there's another of those foundational principles, which is around increasing access to new technologies. So I suppose that seems to logically follow on from that, increasing the availability of information, although technology is not only about sharing information. So how does technology play that role in openness and accountability beyond the information piece?
It ought to make it very much easier. It ought to make the idea of how you connect very much easier. I mean, we've all over the last year or so got used to living on Zoom or the equivalent. Others are available. And that sort of shift in how we connect and the desire for instant information really has shifted how governments have to think about their information. And digital technology and data itself have become almost ends in themselves, but they aren't. They are tools and bits of our kit. We need to be really thoughtful about the public benefit of any of the elements that we're working on. So in Scottish Government, one of the things that we're looking at the moment, for instance, is procurement innovation around the use of digital technology. And we're trying to think about that in an ethical way. So what are the ethics that sit behind? What are the moral decisions that you have to take when you're looking at something like that? Countries like Estonia or Ukraine, both of which are powerful open government organizations, have, if you like, been able to have that blank sheet of paper. When the Russians marched out in 1991, there was a very little of their existing system surviving. So they were able to become digital nations. And in Estonia, everyone is given an email address at birth, and that's your kind of connection. We don't have that blank piece of paper here, so we have to be much more thoughtful about how we apply these things. And so there's a lot of work in open government, thinking about how you use digital technology, thinking what the public benefit is, something like the shifts towards the use of algorithms. We've just done a really interesting piece of work, citizen jury, looking at the use of algorithms around waiting for COVID vaccination. So that kind of thoughtfulness is, these things might help. They might help
government get it right, but we have to make sure the public are comfortable with them too. Yeah, absolutely. And sort of turning to that outward facing view of people, of our society, there's a goal around supporting civic participation. Now, I imagine that can take all forms, from very micro activities all the way through to sort of, evangelistic, volunteerism. What does that supporting civic participation really look like in reality? Why does it matter as well? It matters because governments around the world are facing very complex issues. We live in a world where all sorts of spheres of government and business interact. That kind of globalism has both strengths and weaknesses, and we need to be really thoughtful about it. But we cannot take action on solving poverty, on solving climate change, without the population sharing activity that will help us get there. So we have to come up with policies that are going to do that. In the most basic way, open government requires us to work with civil society, and the civil society open government network across the UK has been pretty active. They aren't always happy with what we do. Quite rightly, they should be challenging us, but it is really important that we see that as a partnership. It isn't just about government opening the door a little bit and saying, "Hi out there, what do you think?" It's absolutely about developing a set of priorities that will work for civil society as well as for government, and looking at how we implement them together. We are, wherever you are in open government partnership, that partnership really matters. So in Scotland, our senior steering group is chaired by a minister, but it is jointly chaired by the civil society chair of the Open Government Network in Scotland. And they take turns in order to make sure that both of those voices have equal weight. Okay. And the last one is around, and it would seem self-evident, but worth saying, implementing the highest standards of professional integrity throughout administrations. I suppose there's a piece of that around that trust there, and that mutual, that mutual social contract between government and people, and so that professional integrity plays into that. It does, and it shouldn't be lip service. This is about all of us as public servants stepping back and thinking what our role is, and being thoughtful about who it is we're trying to make sure benefits from whatever our work is. The greatest disinfectant is sunlight. So transparency really matters, and being honest and open with the public where we have issues around how the administration works. So publishing the ways, the things that are of highest priority to us, publishing who is in government. I mean, one of the most interesting events I ever ran was a democracy event with a very senior academic, and we were talking about how the public can influence the work of government. And he started his presentation by saying, but government's a black box. You look at government and you've no idea how to find an individual. Try picking up the phone to government and you can't identify an individual. I hadn't thought of it in that way, but he's absolutely right. So we need to be thoughtful about how we connect, how we come over, and that integrity piece really matters. The duty of candor, the ideas around openness and transparency, proactive publication, and of course, in Scotland, we've been looking at our civil service obligations in the service of Scotland, being thoughtful about how we come over to each other as an internal audience, as well as with the public. Because that really matters, how we behave to each other. So we have ideas around kindness and respect in there. All of that really matters, but it
it can't just be lip service. If it is just lip service, then what you end up with is a working environment that is not comfortable. So everyone has to be transparent if anybody is, and we all have to be thoughtful about what that integrity means, and who else needs to understand the thing that we're talking about. Some people see open government as freedom of information on speed. It absolutely isn't. It is so much more. In Scotland, I'm sure you know, we have a national performance framework which sets out the priorities for how the outcomes that we would like the people of Scotland to feel living in Scotland. And the one I guess we're probably all most proud of is that we grow up loved in Scotland. You know, these are, if you like, our kind of lodestone around how we get to those. But you have to have a set of principles, and we have a single purpose, which includes being thoughtful about how we have Scotland as a successful place, what that means, and how we have a well-being economy that is thinking about both people and planet. And it's always difficult to fit these priorities together, but unless you have a clear direction, then actually it is more difficult for people, particularly in public service, to see where they're headed and to understand that however small our individual roles are, that we're all trying to do something that is very much worthwhile.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's interesting to look at how these very powerful foundational principles actually play out. As you said, the key is that they're not just written on paper, they actually are transforming the way that Scottish government behaves, but then even more importantly, how that plays out in terms of impact on society, on communities. And so I guess it's a good point to turn our attention to the 2021 to 26 action plan around open government, which I know you're very proud of. And within that, there are the 5 kind of key areas of focus. And we could probably talk for an hour on each of them, because you know these are big chunky issues. So we've got financial transparency, climate change, health and social care, citizen participation, data and digital. Now there's a lot there, but tell me a bit about the plan and I guess how you see it playing out, and what's going to be happening over the course of these 5 years, where the key areas of focus, how you see action happening within those big chunky topics, because as we said, each one in and of itself is huge. So where does the plan take you?
So it's a really interesting question, because as a local open government, so we have been, whether you describe it naughty or clever, in packing an awful lot in to 5. So these are the things that, as we talk to the public, whether it was in our Citizen Assembly on the future of Scotland, whether it was on our Citizen Assembly on climate change, whether it's on our health national conversation, these are the things that have again and again come up as the things that people really care about. And that we are questioned about all the time. So we see that there's a really big piece of work around making sure people can see and understand the flow of money in Scotland, how that works, and how decisions are made. And there's a really powerful piece of work that actually started several years ago, but this keeps a focus on it and really brings in civil society involvement in that commitment. So it's a very particular piece of work. The last commitment had a really detailed look internationally at how we could do that well. And we've just published a report on that. So that one is a really important one. It's absolutely foundational to making Scottish government not seem, but be as open as it can be. The 2 really big areas where we have seen people in Scotland really expressing concern about what comes next. And the first, of course, coming out of the pandemic is health and social care. And in particular, how we reform our health system and our social care system in order that it meets the needs of the population. So the commitment is not about what we do. There's a big reform plan for that. It's about how we involve others and what at what points, in what roles, and how we get the citizen voice into that piece of work around the really big health reforms. It's a huge amount of the Scottish budget goes on health. So that's a fantastically important one. The climate change one similarly. We cannot deal with climate change unless we look at involving business, organizations, but also individuals. We all have to accept responsibility and make some changes. So that commitment actually was very difficult to achieve because of course COP was in Glasgow last year, and as we were trying to develop it, having two sets of conversations was actually quite difficult. Yeah. So we are still framing that. But it's fundamentally one of the big societal issues that unless we can do it in an open government way, then actually we're stuffed, basically. And there's real recognition within government of the need to work with our population. The final two on citizen participation and data and digital are what we see as kind of big enabling commitments. So they are supporting the others. We are really thoughtful about how we institutionalize better ways of involving the public, whether that's through data and digital or whether it's through active citizen participation. As I said, we've already run 2 citizen assemblies in Scotland and a run of citizen juries and mini publics. And the aim with these is to use much more deliberative methods so that people have a shared understanding of an issue, are able to hear each other's views, and then come to a set of recommendations. They aren't and won't be decision-making bodies, but they are providing really clear evidence of the views of the population. The people who are participating in them are able to do that as individuals, so they are randomly selected and weighted in order to make sure we have a distribution across the population. We're very particularly in that piece of work around participation, thinking about equality and thinking about how we shift some of the balance of power. Our current political system is what it is, but having the support of a much more deliberative part of that system means that we would like there to be a clearer way of making sure we get to the people furthest away from government first, and you'll pick up everyone else on the way back. So trying to apply the kinds of equalities and support for people to participate in order to make sure we're getting a really clear, actually reaching the people who need their services most. Yeah. So it's about how we bed that in. We've just had an expert working group, which is our first open government milestone met, yay, looking at the institutionalization of participative and deliberative democracy. I know it's a really snappy title, but it kind of does what it says on the tin, where the government has proposed that we will have regular and routine citizen assemblies. So how do we make those meaningful? How do we make sure that they are not the only way that people can participate? And how do we keep the standards and principles really high so that participation is both a benefit for government, but is also very clearly a benefit to the people who are taking part and to really changing the kinds of policies, making them more credible, making them more linked to what people want.
Absolutely. And there are some fantastic founding principles, but then also within the action plan itself, some clearly world-changing goals that are being pursued and facilitated. So I suppose what are the challenges that potentially will get in the way, not just in Scotland, for any organization in public sector, for any government. Where do you see the biggest sort of pain points? And then I suppose, well, you know, if you see them coming, what can you do about them to make sure that the principles that everybody would see as entirely, you know, worthwhile pursuing don't fall by the wayside? Easier said than done, I'm sure.
Much easier said than done. So there's a challenge for all of us. There's always too much to do, and adding yet another thing in always seems really difficult. So what we are trying to encourage people to do is think very early in their process, whether it is about what technology they need, but also how they involve people. Rather than retrofitting something like participation, getting in at the beginning and being thoughtful who you need to involve all the way through, convincing your senior team that this actually will give you a more credible set of outcomes. And we are beginning to see that happening. You're never going to convert everybody overnight, but if we continue to feed it into how people learn as they come into government, how they see their role, and how they develop individual policies, and give them a supporting hand rather than telling people off, it's always much more useful. One of the really interesting things is seeing people who have been skeptical, if you like, around the use of this, sitting in a room with a group of citizens who are deeply involved in a conversation and come up with really useful ideas. And the change in them is really interesting to see, you know, that suddenly there's a sort of falling away of the scales, and all of that, it has to work for government as well. It can't be abstract and something that's just a nice to have. Unless it provides benefits, then, you know, it won't happen. But we are trying to feed that into, which is why our plan looks not just at the things that we are going to do. So there's a set of milestones. We try and feed the open government principles into the important bits of work around strategy that are going on. So there's a refresh of the National Performance Framework, for instance, and they are, of course, being as open and transparent as they can be, and are thinking about how they involve people all the way through. The other thing that open government does is it's an international organisation, so we aren't on our own. We do a lot of work internationally with the other members, both at national level and at local level. So Scotland is involved quite a bit with the Nordic countries, and OGP has a Nordic country group. There's a discussion we've got in a couple of weeks with all the my equivalents from all of the Nordic countries, looking at how we increase the weight of what open government does in each of our jurisdictions. So if you like, it's a bit like a sort of Alcoholics Anonymous for reformers. A trouble shared is a trouble halved. And that aspect, there is always somebody somewhere in the open government family that is sharing the same problems that you're facing. We are working quite closely with Buenos Aires at the moment around climate change. They're doing some incredibly interesting work, getting a platform up and running for the population in Buenos Aires to be able to monitor their climate change actions and see if there is progress. And we're doing work with the public here. So what we're creating is a network for open government members to come together and test how they develop useful commitments that are going to help them deliver their work and share a bit of learning for each of us. So we try and make the most of those international learning experiences. And it is really interesting. that many of the global south countries that you would not necessarily expect to be particularly open and transparent have some really interesting ways of involving their population. Places in Ghana doing some fantastic work about land reform, Nigeria looking at women's rights, and some of the places where I find the most learning are unexpected to me. And that's because I'm a global north person and have lived in that kind of way. And I love that. It is just so refreshing to be able to think about how collectively, because all of the really big issues are international. And the one that none of us is really looking at is migration. And I think that is, if you like, the next big one. It is, of course, a climate change issue, but thinking about how we collectively, internationally, come around and put in place ways of being thoughtful and kind about making sure that the world population isn't overpowering the planet, but is properly supporting itself. So, some of these really big issues internationally, and they boil down to individual actions. And it's that lovely connection between the global and the really, really micro-local that really is helpful. And Open Government Partnership is a really interesting organization because it's a broad tent. You have to be really quite naughty to be thrown out, but there is a real desire to help people get to the point of reform. So that feels like a positive approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's going to be exciting to see how both globally and in Scotland the goals play out. 5-year action plan, some incredible areas of focus. So we'll keep an eye out to see how it plays out in Scotland. Really looking forward to seeing how it sort of takes hold. It's been a fantastic conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, so I'm really grateful to you for sharing your view of open government and then getting into some of that reality of how it's actually sort of making a difference in Scotland and how it's anticipated over the next few years. So just want to say thank you, Doreen, for joining me for the conversation.
Thank you very much for asking. Lovely to meet you. Bye-bye.
So thank you to Doreen for joining me for that conversation. Really exciting to hear about the work Scotland's got going on around open government, how those principles are playing out with action plans for the next 5 years. We're going to keep a watching eye on those as they play out, to see how Scotland absorbs some of the interesting, innovative projects that are happening around the world and how they play out in their own territories. Really exciting work there, and fantastic to see those principles being adhered to and built into design and execution of public services as well. Great conversation with Doreen, so thanks again to her. We'll be back soon with another conversation with a public sector changemaker, but until then, goodbye.